Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jason Marzak, Vice President, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arch Latin America Center. And it's great to have you join us for this timely and crucial discussion on the regional response to Venezuela's migration crisis. I'm absolutely thrilled today to be joined by Marta Lucia Ramirez, former Vice President of Colombia and also a Senior Advisor for our Venezuela Solutions Group, as well as Marta Youth, Acting Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration at the State Department, as well as a fantastic group of experts that you'll hear from in just a moment. Here at the Atlantic Council, we have followed developments in Venezuela closely, and we will continue to do so as Nicolas Maduro seeks to assume another illegitimate mandate in January following the July 28th stolen presidential election, in which opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez won by more than twice as many votes as Maduro. In the aftermath of that stolen election, the government has engaged in a violent campaign of repression targeting both political opponents and civil society. Today, nearly 2,000 Venezuelans have been detained as a result of this repression, albeit with 225, as the government announced, released over the last weekend. Before the election, approximately 8 million Venezuelans had fled the country in the last decade, over 6.5 million living in Latin America and the Caribbean. But available polling suggests migration flows are likely to rise further, not only in the lead up to, but also in the aftermath of the January inauguration in Venezuela. Meanwhile, the US is preparing for a political transition in January, as President-elect Donald Trump will govern with the majority in both the House and the Senate. The Trump administration will prioritize immigration as a cornerstone of its policy, with more details still forthcoming on its approach to migration policy in the hemisphere overall. What we've seen over the years is the need for regional leaders to strengthen coordination mechanisms to develop a more resilient and efficient response strategy for Venezuelan migrants and refugees. And without a democratic transition in Venezuela that will secure a more prosperous future, Venezuelans will continue to seek refuge in other parts of the hemisphere. They will be forced to undertake dangerous journeys to reach safety, including crossing the Darien Gap between Colombia and Panama on the route north. Not only has the Darien been called a uniquely inhospitable terrain for its mountainous rainforests and muddy conditions, but it's also become a source for the Clan de Golfo cartel and others to profit from human trafficking and smuggling. Later this week, while in Panama, I hope to see firsthand, weather permitting, the challenges being faced in Panama and for migrants when crossing through the Darien. At the Adrian Arch Latin America Center, we will continue to push for regional coordination on international efforts to support the Venezuelan people. One leader in the international response to Venezuelan migration has been Colombia, which currently hosts more than 2.8 million displaced Venezuelans. With that, I'm thrilled to have with us today former Colombian Vice President Marta Lucia Ramirez to contextualize Colombia's approach to receiving Venezuelan migrants. Vice President Ramirez has been vocal in her support for return to democracy in Venezuela and can also speak firsthand to the challenges and ways that Colombia has addressed Venezuelan migration. It was not easy, but in the previous administration, Colombia made significant strides to provide opportunities to fleeing Venezuelans, as well as to stand up to the Maduro regime. Vice President Ramirez, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jason. It's a pleasure for me to share this important panel and also to share with people like you, David Smolansky, Marta, some others who have been very committed with the return of democracy, because this is the main cause of all this migration problem in Latin America. So let me say that undoubtedly migration crisis is affecting not only Colombia or Latin America, this is affecting the entire world. And the World Economic Forum showed us in a report about global risks. This is a report that they did, and it's ranked by the main severity risks for the next 2 and the next 10 years. And both years, both scenarios shows how important is migration as a risk for stability, for economy in different regions of the world. So we have to be aware about what is causing this migration in the entire world. In Latin American continent, of course, we have this particular situation because of non-democracy. And this is not only Venezuela, this is Cuba, this is Nicaragua, this is, of course, Venezuela. So that's why we need to work together in order to ask for democracy, in order to push for democracy. I'm convinced that Volansky, Maria Corina, Edmundo Gonzalez, all of them are heroes because they are fighting not only for themselves, they are fighting for a country, they are fighting for an entire region. And this is something that we cannot leave them alone. We need to support, we need to be very solidary in our countries in terms of understanding that democracy means freedom for all of us in the future. So yes, Colombia made a lot of efforts since the year 2017. It was in Santos administration when they start this program for Venezuelans refugees, but during President Duque administration, we create this specific program, which is called the temporary protection status, and it was created for 2 million Venezuelans. Nowadays, we calculate that we have in Colombia at least 3 million of Venezuelans. Unfortunately, not all of them have benefit from this temporary status, and this is also because with the new government, with federal administration, they almost stopped all this program for Venezuelan migrants. As you know, he's a very close friend of Maduro, and he has been very solidary with Maduro instead of democracy for Venezuela. So that's why the migration program has changed in the last 2 years in Colombia for bad for Venezuelans. But I am convinced that we need to understand that migration is something that we need to work together, also having in perspective that we need to have more creativity, we need to have a better understanding about the lack of economic opportunities, about the regional problems in different countries of Latin America, and also the conflict and insecurity. So all these aspects of the migration causes is something that we need to work in this very integral, from this integral point of view. And this is why in Colombia, we assume that the Colombian budget must be increased, especially in terms of education, health, and some different labor programs for Venezuelan migrants. But in the last 3 years, you know, after COVID, the economic situation have been very difficult in Colombia and in the entire region. So that's why it's not easy to assume more migrants, not now, not in the future. So we need to be clear that the entire region is having these problems of lack of economic opportunities, is having the problems of instability and insecurity. So we need to work in order to avoid a new migration flows in Latin America, and mainly new migration flows coming from Venezuela. As you mentioned, Jason, in January 10th, President Edmundo Gonzalez must assume as a president of Venezuela, and we cannot have doubt about it, because if we have this language that says if Maduro stays in power, we are opening the door for Maduro. And let me say that we need to be very straight in terms of reject any idea that Maduro can stay. So that's why the new administration in the United States could also be an opportunity to send a clear message that nobody is going to accept that he stays in power. So we are only 53 days from now until the 10th of January, and we need to have a bit every single day. We have 52 more days, 51 more days, 50 more days in order to have Edmundo Gonzalez as the president of Venezuelans, because if not, it's going to be a crisis for the entire region, including the United States. Let me say that this is not only the Colombian problem. As you know, Colombia, Peru, Chile, we are the main countries where Venezuelan diaspora is right now in Latin America. But in the future, if it could be this scenario that Maduro stays, it could be more than 8 million people again going out from Venezuela to the region, and it includes the United States, as I mentioned before. As you know, Ortega in Nicaragua, he has been supporting all these flows of migrants to the United States. So we have this humanitarian crisis in the border of the United States with Mexico, but we also have a problem in different countries which are for transit, like Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica. All of them have the same problems because they have no the capacity to assume all these migrants. When we were in government in October 21st, I invite a meeting with different ministers of foreign affairs from the region. There were almost all, I think there were like 29 ministers of foreign affairs, in order to send a clear message about democracy, but also in order to send a message about solidarity and to have a new perspective for economic possibilities in the entire region. Let me say that nowadays it's unfortunate. It's impossible to have an idea of integration processes within the hemisphere. It's not going to be possible again, unfortunately. But the United States can use the leadership in order to have a kind of proposal to develop food security and also energy security for democratic nations in our hemisphere. The United States has the leadership in order to ask the World Bank and the IMF to provide loans, long-term loans for those democratic nations in the hemisphere, in order to use all these opportunities to produce food, to produce energy, renewable energy, which is something that the entire world needs. So if we can create investments, if we can create jobs in our region, we will have less problems of migration, because again, this is not only because of Venezuela. There is a lot of Latin American people coming to the United States because these other reasons. So we have to analyze that in the next future, we need to be very radical against Maduro as an illegitimate dictatorship in Venezuela, but we also need to promote this kind of leadership, more proactive and more capable to confront the Chinese and the Russian and the Iran penetrating strategies in Latin America. Because as you know, we have to see migration not only as a humanitarian problem, we need to see migration as a security problem for all our countries. When we did that ministerial meeting in October 21st in Colombia, we were in a crisis in the border with Panama because El Darién, as you know, and we were talking with the Minister of Panama, Erika Muñez, about the crisis that they also had, but we also in Colombia. So we were giving these opportunities through the promotion, through the temporary status. As you know, it includes 10 years to stay in Colombia, access to jobs. It includes also access to education and health, mainly for children, but it was so difficult to assume more and more and more. So when we did that conference of ministers, we shared with all of them the economic conditions. It was after COVID, but nowadays it's still very difficult to Latin America to maintain their own inhabitants in their countries, because people is looking for opportunities outside. So we know the new administration will have a very strong position against new migration, new migrants in the United States, but we also need to maintain this position in order to recreate, in order to be more creative, more active to develop these new opportunities in Latin America. For Colombia, the economic impact of all these temporary status has been so big, but again, we are not in a very positive economic condition right now to repeat a new program in a year or 2 years from now. It will be absolutely impossible for Colombia. So that's why we need to work in the idea of a different economic recovery, a different economic strategy. And let me say, I know that this is not very good in terms of politics, but the Chinese has been developing all these routes, all these Silk Route. The Silk Route, it's including 156 countries. Colombia was not on that, but recently President Petro, he announced that Colombia will be part of this Silk Route. So we need to create this counter strategy to promote food security, to promote energy security strategy, and this is going to be a better route in order to create wealth, jobs, in order to stop migration to the United States and within our region. You know, the humanitarian indexes are so bad for the region. All these children, manipulation of children and women, prostitution, everything is becoming really bad for the entire region in terms of humanitarian situation, but also in terms of security situation. So more than numbers about Colombia, I want to raise the attention about what we have to do in the next future, not only because of Venezuela, but also because the region as a whole has a big problem with migration. So thank you
so much,
Jason.
Vice President Ramirez. Thank you so much for those excellent insights. Important, you're mentioning not only the illegitimate mandate that Maduro will seek to take again in January, but also the resulting geopolitical tensions and I think as we'll hear from the panel later as well. I know I've spoken with David Smolensky about this. The fact that Maduro and power will only continue to accelerate outward flows of migrants. So thank you so much for those comments. I now want to turn over to Marta Youth, who serves as Acting Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration at the State Department. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Looking forward to your insights on how State Department is approaching the context of Venezuelan migration, and also some of the advancements that you've seen and what you're looking to moving forward. So with that, I'll turn over to Acting Assistant Secretary Youth.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Jason, for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here with you today. I'd like to really commend the Atlantic Council and its Adrienne Arsht Center for organizing this timely and important event on the topic of enhancing efforts to support the integration of Venezuelan refugees and migrants within the Western Hemisphere. The world is facing historic levels of forced displacement. More than 120 million people have been forcibly displaced globally, and 21 million of those are displaced across the Western Hemisphere alone. But these are not just numbers. Behind each number is a human life, an individual, many of whom are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. Today, the UN estimates there are 7.6 million people inside Venezuela who need immediate humanitarian assistance, and an additional 7.85 million Venezuelans displaced outside Venezuela, with the majority living in 17 countries across the region. The United States is the largest single donor of humanitarian assistance for the response to the Venezuela regional crisis. In the last fiscal year, 2024, We provided nearly $625 million in humanitarian aid to alleviate suffering and to support refugees, asylum seekers, and other vulnerable populations of concern. So this brings total U.S. assistance for the response to the Venezuela regional crisis to more than $4.1 billion since 2017. U.S. assistance has been critical to establish and support the regional humanitarian infrastructure and response architecture that has put our international organization and NGO partners and host countries in a better position to receive, protect, and integrate Venezuelans closer to home. And that has been the real key. For this regional response to work, it was essential that partner nations in the region agree to share responsibility and agree to be part of the solution. And through their generosity, this has really been the most important piece of this puzzle. In 2022, the United States joined 21 other countries in the Western Hemisphere to endorse the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection and its shared commitments under 4 pillars: stability and assistance, regular migration pathways and protection of displaced populations, humane migration management, and coordinated emergency response. In line with the declaration, we're working to help Venezuelans and other refugees and migrants find stability and protection and integrate and contribute to their host communities. While PRM's funding provides life-saving support, including water and hygiene, shelter, child protection, gender-based violence response and prevention, our assistance doesn't just focus on meeting basic needs. We work to help provide solutions in the region so that vulnerable migrants and refugees do not feel that continued displacement is their only option. So the programs we're funding are helping people integrate into the communities through support for regularization, livelihoods programs, job placement, legal assistance, and other efforts. We're also aware that our programs target refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. And while those are the target populations, we also know that our programs must also include vulnerable members of host community to help integrate and foster integration and social cohesion. One of the most important things a host government can do is provide vulnerable refugees and migrants with legal status. And as one refugee in the region told me, his most valuable belonging was the plastic card in his wallet. And he took out his wallet and pulled out the card. And he said this was provided by his host government, showing that he had the right to be in that country. U.S. assistance has supported governments across the region with the capacity and the ability to provide lawful residency and work status to millions of refugees and migrants, not only those fleeing Venezuela, but refugees and migrants from Nicaragua, Haiti, and elsewhere. Let me give you a key example, and Vice President Ramirez already spoke a bit about this. Through our international organization partners, we provided the technology infrastructure, including the biometric printers and 2 million temporary protected status cards in support of the government of Colombia's regularization efforts. Over 2.5 million Venezuelans have settled in Colombia with TPS that has enabled their access to education, healthcare, and employment. When the government of Colombia first issued those cards, they chose to print the word visibles on each card, saying these Venezuelan guests need not live in the shadows or in the margins of society. They had a place and they were visible. The government of Colombia announced an extension of the program in April 2024, and the estimate is that it will give status to an additional 600,000 migrants. Another excellent example in the region is our partnership with Brazil. U.S. assistance supports Brazil's generous Operación Acogida, and that's a program which has received and facilitated the voluntary relocation of more than 128,000 Venezuelans from border regions to over 1,000 cities for jobs and family reunification. I was actually in Boa Vista, I think in 2017 or early 2018, when the government of Brazil began this process. To date, they've provided temporary residency to more than 420 individuals and granted refugee status to another 100,000 individuals since the program began. And a recent IOM study found that 8 of 10 adults had found employment or started their own businesses. Ecuador also has been a generous host, and we've contributed robustly to support their regularization program, which has benefited 200,000 plus Venezuelans who've registered, and of those, 95,000 have already received their cards. I mean, I could keep going, but I think these examples show and give a sense of how vital and invaluable it is to include Venezuelan refugees and migrants in the biggest, to include them in the largest sense of the word, to give them a sense of belonging, to make them a part of the community. Studies show that when you integrate new arrivals, they thrive. Venezuelan refugees and migrants contribute to their host communities, and they can drive economic development in their host countries. That's one reason we contributed $96.8 million to support refugee hosting communities in Colombia, Costa Rica, and Ecuador through the World Bank's Global Concessional Financing Facility. These are the projects, like the Vice President Ramirez was saying, these are projects that support national infrastructure, in this case for healthcare, education, and other services needed in communities hosting large numbers of refugees and migrants. A joint World Bank and UNHCR study found that 65% of Venezuelan migrants in Ecuador and 95.5% in Colombia are highly skilled young workers who want to stay where they are. The IMF reported that the inflow of Venezuelan migrants to Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru boosted the labor force and contributed to GDP growth. I'm really proud of the work that we've done with our international organization partners and host countries across the region. It's important that countries in the region continue to steadfastly support regularization and integration efforts. There may be new challenges to come, and we're seeing some of those already. For instance, we appreciate that Argentina and other governments in the region have already begun to provide flexibility and documentation for new arrivals, such as accepting expired passports, given that it's really hard for people to get new passports. We're confident that the collaboration and partnership we've developed as a region and the regional migration and humanitarian architecture that we've built together over the past few years will help us all better manage any future displacements in the region. As Secretary Blinken has said on more than one occasion, this is one challenge no one country alone can handle. As a region, we are really fortunate to have such extraordinary neighbors who are committed to giving vulnerable individuals the opportunity to live dignified lives as members of their community. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marta, for those incredible comments and also for all the work that you do and continue to do in regard to migrant coordination, migrant integration across the hemisphere, which is absolutely fundamental given the challenges we see now, but also the expectations that those numbers will only continue to potentially increase in the years ahead, especially with continued instability in Venezuela, among other things. So thank you very much again to you. Thank you again, Vice President Ramirez, for joining us for this opening. And now with that, I'd like to turn over to Jeff Ramsey, our Senior Fellow for Venezuela and Colombia, to moderate a panel discussion on opportunities to improve coordination on regional integration efforts. Jeff?
Jason,
Thank you so much.
excuse me. Jason, can you give me just a minute? Because unfortunately, I have to leave. And I want to tell you that I made a mistake. I thought that I had 20 minutes for my intervention. So that's why I just sent it to Geoffrey. And it has all the numbers about how much the Colombian government has invested in education, health, infrastructure. And as Marta has mentioned, for us, the United States support has been so important on that field, but the effort was mainly with the Colombian budget. So you have in your hands the paper that I prepared with all the numbers and clear information about these efforts from Colombia. So thank you very much for this additional minute. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm sure we can put that online and find opportunities to circulate all that important work. Jeff, let me turn over to you.
Yeah, no, and thank you so much, Vice President Ramirez and Assistant Secretary of Youth for your remarks. And of course, Vice President Ramirez, we will ensure that your presentation is available online. Thanks again for your participation. As we just heard, Venezuela's crisis has fueled the largest wave of one of the largest waves of mass migration in the hemisphere's recent history. We're talking about nearly 8 million Venezuelans who fled the country in recent years. Of course, with Nicolas Maduro preparing to assume yet another illegitimate mandate in January, we expect these numbers to increase. And of course, we know that this issue will be top of mind, both in the region with our closest partners in Latin America, as well as here in Washington with the incoming administration. Of course, amidst all of this, stronger regional and multilateral coordination is going to be absolutely critical to ensure that there is an effective response across the Americas. Integration of migrants, of course, is not just about meeting humanitarian needs, it's about unlocking economic opportunities. So, of course, if governments invest in policies that can ease access to education and healthcare and the labor market, they can harness this potential to drive growth and innovation. For us at the Council, this is an opportunity to highlight this issue right now and also to demonstrate the best of what our hemisphere can achieve when we work together by broadening access to regular status and sharing the burden of migrant integration across all of our allies across Latin America. We can turn this moment of need into a moment of shared strength. Of course, to address this question and to highlight the opportunities in the months ahead, I'm joined by an incredible panel. We have with us today Laura Dib, who is the Venezuela Program Director at the Washington Office on Latin America. We have Paula Rosiasco, who is a Senior Social Development Specialist at the World Bank with extensive experience working on the response to migration across the region. And David Smolansky, Venezuelan opposition leader and deputy director of the Con Venezuela presidential campaign here in Washington, D.C., and also a dissident and residence fellow at SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. I want to remind everybody joining us today that we want this to be a conversation. So if you are watching this online, please feel free to submit your questions to the panel to our app, Ask AC. You can see it right on your screens. You can go to askac.org and your questions will pop up to share with our panelists and get their perspective on the issues that you raise. So let's dive into it. David, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind. The Venezuelan diaspora in the hemisphere has grown exponentially in the last couple of years. Do you expect to see yet another wave of migration in the coming months leading up to Maduro's plan to assume a new mandate on January 10th? And can you just walk us through the link between the political crisis and, of course, the flow of migrants and refugees as you see it?
Thank you, Jael, for having me, and thank you, Jason, as well, for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with Laura, Paula, and also with former Vice President of Colombia, Marta Lucía Ramirez, a good friend of the democratic cause of Venezuela. Unfortunately, a new wave of migrants started since July 28th. I would say that probably we are witnessing the biggest migration outflow due to political reasons since this crisis started a decade ago. Official numbers say that at least 108,000 Venezuelans have fled the country since July 28th. And that's a very conservative number because Colombia has only published the outflow of August, Brazil, August, and September. And we have Panama until October. Actually, 50,000 Venezuelans have crossed the Darien Gap since August 1st. And in the case of Brazil, 25,000 Venezuelans have fled the country through Brazil in July and August, and in Colombia, only August, 33,000. But I could stay on and on numbers. We have to remember that we are talking here about human beings. We're talking here teenagers, children, women, and that were heavily persecuted because a lot of them were part of our campaign team that were crucial to win the election on July 28th. Many of the Venezuelans who have fled were volunteers, were poll watchers, were people who encourage others to vote on July 28th. And as far as I know, that's not a crime. And their houses have been marked by the DGCIM, by the SEBIN. Their families have been threatened. Some members of their families actually have been illegally detained and are part of those 2,000 who are today on the different jails that the regime has for political prisoners. And I would say that officially a new migration outflow started, that if Maduro prevails, hopefully not, it will continue, it will increase. Unfortunately, the UN platform R4B has not updated the numbers. Still, we are on 7.7 million, but I will be very responsible to say that we have already surpassed the 8 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees, according to different NGOs and civil society groups. I think it is important to see here that the root cause is a dictatorship. That phrase, root cause, it is very common to hear in Washington, D.C. You know this, right? Root causes or poverty or crime or corruption. I wouldn't say that those are not root cause in other countries in the region. But in the case of Venezuela, it's a brutal dictatorship. And the myth of the sanctions is a myth. Why? Well, in October, almost 950,000 oil barrels were produced daily. Largest oil production in Venezuela since 2020. And you're having almost 2,000 Venezuelans fleeing daily. So no, it doesn't matter if you produce more oil, people are going to flee because Maduro and Diosdado Cabello are running the country. And those two, among others, are today investigated by the International Criminal Court for committing crimes against humanity. Let's remember that the regime started after July 28th, the knock-knock operation, in Spanish, the Tun-Tun operation. And this is literally like that members from the DGCIM, which is the counterintelligence agency, SEBIN, the intelligence agency, National Guard, they went to our homes and they do like this, knock the door to illegally detain people, including between women and children and teenagers, more than 300 between them, which in the case of women, many of them unfortunately have been sexually abused. In the case of children, have been physically and psychologically abused. So for many, the only way to survive is fleeing the country. Since 2021, between Cubans and Venezuelans, 1.5 million people from those two countries have come to the US through the southern border. Root cause again, brutal dictatorship. I don't see anyone fleeing to Cuba. I don't see anyone fleeing to Venezuela. I don't see anyone fleeing to Nicaragua. People are fleeing regimes that do not provide liberties, that do not provide democracy, that do not have independent institutions, that do not protect human civil rights. So we are working as hard as we can to have a peaceful and democratic transition in Venezuela, because we want to stop people fleeing our country, but at the same time, we want many of those 8 million to go back, to be part of the rebuilding of the country, but especially to be reunified with our family. Because the most perverse issue that you face when you have a brutal dictatorship is the separation of the family.
Thanks for that, David. I think it's important that you mentioned that no one's fleeing to Venezuela, right? Because that wasn't always the case. The reality is that in the latter half of the last century, Venezuela received millions of Colombians fleeing Venezuela's armed conflict. And we've seen how Colombia sort of struggled. Vice President Ramirez alluded to this, to suddenly become a host country almost overnight in a very short period of time, and to adapt to the needs of Venezuelan migrants in the hemisphere, along with so many other countries, to ensure that their legal and socioeconomic needs are met. I want to turn to you, Laura. I know you've been working on this issue for a very long time. How do you think countries like Colombia and other host countries in the region can better ensure that the needs of Venezuelans already living within their borders are met without overwhelming resource capacity? I would also love your thoughts on the root causes question, and how can we ensure that the response to fleeing Venezuelans, of course, doesn't overshadow the need for a democratic solution inside Venezuela?
Thank you so much to the Atlantic Council, to Jeff, for this invitation. I think to me, it's unbelievable that after so many years of Venezuelan migration, we continue to discuss this, and we continue to arrive to the same conclusion, which is that not enough has been done. And not enough has been done because precisely, and I would like to go back to what Secretary of Youth said, which is the need for a legal status in each of the countries. So there hasn't been a coordinated and regional response to migration from a human rights perspective. The response has been fragmented, it has been uncoordinated, and there has been a generalized resistance by the international community to recognize Venezuelan migration or Venezuelan migrants and refugees as people with a need of international protection under the Cartagena Declaration, even though 16 countries have included this declaration into their own legislations. So even though it is not a binding treaty, once it has been included into their norms, it should be enforced like that. But it has not been the case, with the exceptions of Mexico and Brazil. So one main point that I want to go back to is if there is not a recognition of the difficulties for Venezuelans to access documentation in their own countries, and also of the circumstances in which they're leaving, then there will not be an adequate response to how these people are arriving to the country, to the receiving country. And I would like to also emphasize that these difficulties have become more and more deep as years go by. Right now, a Venezuelan passport, if it's issued from Venezuela, costs $216 when the minimum wage is $4. And if you're trying to access the document from a consulate abroad, which already entails the difficulty of having a consulate, as you know, many countries don't have diplomatic relationships with the government, like the US being the third receiving country of Venezuelans, and therefore we cannot access a document abroad. But if it were the case that there's a consulate, like for example, in the case of Colombia, then it would cost $316. So imagine what that's like for somebody in that circumstance. Then the other element, which is a fairly new pattern of repression and political persecution, has been the annulment of passports of activists, of human rights defenders, of journalists. What does that mean? That means that the administrative authority in charge of documentation, which is the SAIME in Venezuela, it depends on the Ministry of Interior and Justice, which is Diosdado Cabello. So this authority has been annulling passports of people that dissent the government or that have spoken out against what happened with the July 28 elections. And they have been annulling the passports of we don't know how many Venezuelans, because it's impossible to gather all of this information. But what it means is that this, tied to the militarization of the airports, makes people leave under very complex conditions, and people are leaving through unauthorized pathways or unauthorized points of entry to Colombia. So to Colombia and to Brazil. But then what that translates into is more difficulties to access a regular migratory status. And I would like to emphasize that, as David mentioned, there are probably more than $8 million, more than 8 million Venezuelans abroad, according to the platform R4V, or the platform by the international humanitarian agencies from the UN and so forth. There are 7.7 million, but the expectation is that because this platform is fed by government figures, it could potentially be a higher number. Out of that number, which represents 27% of the population in Venezuela, 1.2 million are asylum seekers, and only less than 350,000 have been recognized as refugees. So there is no symmetry between, on the one hand, the solidarity that there has been with the need for a democratic solution in Venezuela, and the lack of solidarity with Venezuelans themselves living under those conditions. There's so much more that I could say, but I know that I'm over the 5 minutes, so I would like to continue the conversation.
Thanks for that. No, a lot to sink our teeth into. And yeah, I mean, I encourage everybody tuning in again. If you have questions for our panelists, join the conversation. Submit your questions to askac.org. Paula, we've been talking about Colombia a lot so far. I know you've studied Colombia's response to Venezuelan migration extensively. In many ways, Colombia has been seen, at least in the region, and particularly in the US, as an example for its approach to Venezuelan migrant integration. What lessons do you think can be taken from the Colombian model that other countries can replicate or learn from?
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for the invitation to this conversation. Indeed, as a technical institution from the World Bank, we have been trying to understand not just the development of human mobility in the region, but also for specific situations like the situation from Venezuela, and also understand or sort of describe, take apart the response of specific countries like Colombia to draw lessons that could be useful for other countries facing massive displacement situations as Colombia has done and other Latin American countries have experienced from Venezuela in the last years. I will highlight two main aspects of the Colombian response that I think are critical for the success, let's say, of these policies in the country, but also that can be replicated elsewhere. The first lesson that I think could be drawn from the Colombian experience is that Colombia invested in understanding the issue and adapting its response to the reality of this situation. The World Development Report that the World Bank published in 2023 highlights that human mobility occurs in a spectrum of situations that range from economic migration, as many of us have been in different moments of our lives, where we move because we find a job and there is a match in the labor market vis-a-vis the conditions that I have as a worker. And in the other end of the spectrum is the refugee situations in which people have, as Lara was mentioning, a need for protection and they are recognized as such. The Venezuelan situation somehow sort of found itself along this spectrum. We had people who at the beginning move more for economic reasons or have resources. They move through the normal or ordinary migratory systems of the countries. But as the situation evolved, the vulnerability of these people increased, and that meant that they were unable to qualify to the visa schemes that many of the Latin American countries had. What Colombia did was understand what were their protection needs, which I think, again, under the Cartagena Convention, as Laura mentioned, they were and they are identified as a group of people in need of protection, and how these vulnerabilities prevented them for accessing regularization. And based on this understanding, they adapted their instruments, the migratory instruments, enabling or creating these instruments that provided both on the one hand, the protections and access that they require, given their specific vulnerabilities, and on the other hand, critical rights that are necessary for sort of win-win response in this case, that were permit to work, permit to move, and access to markets and services in the same conditions as locals. But regularization was just the first part of the response, no? And understanding how they needed to adapt their instruments to this response was the first part. Then the whole range of policies that Colombia adopted afterwards were evidence-based policies. And I will highlight this as the second key lesson learned. Of course, Colombia is immersed in a region in which human mobility and migration, and specifically forced displacement, is understood as a development problem, as a risk. And Colombia took the chance, and I think that it was partly because of the fact that Venezuela was our neighbor country, partly because Colombia has a long history of Colombians emigrating or being displaced because of security conditions. But also, I think that because Colombian government was and has been traditionally very technocratic, took the chance of thinking of these issues and analyzing really what were the implications for growth of this demographic situation, no? The significant growth of people in vulnerable conditions that Colombia was experiencing. We supported the Colombian government through this process, and we quickly understood that for every peso that Colombia invested in integration to return to the country in the way of economic growth, of GDP growth. But this was conditioned to regularization. But more importantly, that regularization will enable access to markets, access to services, and will facilitate the emergence of a new social contract in which there was the provision of critical information to the public to understand the situation, to provide answers to nationals and migrants on what does it mean this for our daily lives. We think that this is a legitimate question on behalf of societies, but more importantly, what was needed in order to transform this challenge into an economic opportunity for all. Colombia has therefore, starting from regularization, they have sort of trickled down a series of policies that has enabled access to markets, access to services, and as I said, free right of movement, right of work. And this has meant that, many years after, indeed, we are having a positive impact on fiscal revenue due to migration. We're having a positive impact in GDP growth due to migration. And that these possibilities can expand if these policies deepen up, not just by enabling this access to markets, but also by facilitating the matching of people with the right characteristics of the labor market. So, for example, a person with higher qualification, should they be enabled to compete for jobs with the qualifications that they have, they will put less pressure on their lower skill labor markets, but it will also produce more income, pay more taxes, have more aggregate demand, more consumption, more investment, and dynamize growth. Thank you.
Thank you. David, going back to you, we have some questions here. A lot of questions basically about people asking about the priorities of the incoming administration. This is a question from Ferdus Intaj, who's asking about basically the approach of the incoming administration, whether this would be a priority. I'm just wondering from your perspective, of course, as an opposition leader, but also, in your previous role as coordinator of the working group at the OAS on this issue, it really felt like in 2021, 2020, this was really a priority. And one big reason for that was the way in which the Venezuela crisis was being discussed in Washington. This is sort of unfair for you to ask you to look into a crystal ball and predict exactly what's going to happen. But what do you think of the way that this issue could come to the forefront in the next administration? Do you see it as an opportunity? Do you see any challenges in ensuring that the migration question remains front of mind in this town?
Well, I think it's still early to answer that question. We are focused on January 10th and the policies that we are implementing from now until that date or beyond that date to have a peaceful and democratic transition in Venezuela. But definitely, yeah, the most important policy that should be implemented not only from the United States of America, but Latin American countries, the European Union, Canada, the UK, among others, is to help Venezuelans to restore democracy, freedom, and access to justice. We are responsible for our actions. We are leading this process. We're having a brave and courageous leader on Maria Corina Machado, who is in a very extreme situation in Venezuela, but she's still very active, having meetings, conferences, and interviews every single day. We have Edmundo Gonzalez, president-elect of Venezuela, which, by the way, as we speak during this event, Secretary Blinken has just called Edmundo Gonzalez as president-elect of Venezuela. He was forced to flee the country. He's in Spain since September, but in these 2 months, he's been very active. He during the last couple of weeks, he's been in Italy, in Germany, in the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So migration will always be probably the issue coming from Venezuela if Maduro and Diosdado Cabello prevail, because that's the root cause, as I said at the beginning, the brutal dictatorship that we are facing. Also, I have to say that on this very perverse system that Venezuelans have been facing, that we have been facing for 25 years, especially during the last few years, I would say since 2020, I was still in the OAS in that moment, the regime and some criminal organized groups used the migration outflow to expand its illicit activities. That is why, for example, we have seen the Tren de Aragua, it is known here in the US as TDA, in at least 8 countries in the Americas. Tren de Aragua now is in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Brazil. Obviously, they have used Panama through the Darien Gap and the US. And we cannot allow that. We cannot allow that because that overshadows the efforts, the sacrifice of the vast majority of Venezuelan migrants and refugees who want to work, who want to study, who want to become entrepreneurs, and who deserve and there is a right to have their documentation. So obviously, anyone who is doing illicit activities, those groups and those members of those groups, in this case, Tren de Aragua, should face the norms and the laws of those countries. And this is not only in the US. We have seen that in Chile, for example. We have seen that in Ecuador. We have seen that in northern Brazil. So, and I think this is important because, again, we cannot allow those criminals to overshadow, again, the effort and the sacrifice of many, many Venezuelans that when you see that they are, working so hard, and I have always said there's no better ambassador for our country than a migrant and refugee, and you feel proud of being a Venezuelan even though you are far from your country. So the best policy to stop the outflow coming from Venezuela is to have a regional and global coordination to implement policies that help Venezuelans to restore democracy, to restore our access to justice, to restore our liberties. Because I'm sure that if we achieve a democratic transition in Venezuela, people are going to stop fleeing, and probably we were going to see the biggest returning of migrants of any migration outflow in the history. The academia says that approximately 30% at its best come back to their original, to your homeland, to the homeland. I would say that this could be something even higher because many Venezuelans, and some polls have shown that, want to go back as soon as there is a political change. So the root cause is the main priority, and it has to be also for for the case of Cubans, because Cuba is going under the radar. But 850,000 Cubans have come to the U.S. since 2022. Has been the largest Cuban migration since the special period during the 1990s, and not many people are talking about it. Again, I haven't seen anyone emigrating to Cuba, to Nicaragua, to Venezuela, to Russia. No one goes to those countries. People go to countries where they could have opportunities, where they could have liberties, where they could work, where they can study. And as Venezuelans, we want to go back.
Thanks. You mentioned the influence of transnational criminal organizations and sort of the connection with the outward flow of migrants and refugees, and of course, vulnerable fleeing Venezuelans, becoming the victim of human smuggling, the illicit economy. One sort of flashpoint for this issue that's really come to a head in recent months is the Darien Gap. Connecting South and Central America. I believe the UN has estimated that by the end of the year, around 800,000 people will have attempted to cross the Darien. I'm wondering, Laura, as someone who's really worked on this for a long time, I know you've gotten a perspective from on the ground. What can be done, particularly with the Darien, coordination between the Panamanian, the Colombian government, greater international attention? What can we do to reduce the risks that Venezuelans and other migrants from Haiti, Ecuador, and other places who are crossing the Darien and putting themselves at the mercy of these criminal groups?
Yes, Jeff, thank you so much for that question. I think to the risk of sounding repetitive, but it's very important to acknowledge several things. The first is seeing migration as a reality that rather than as an issue or risk, or avoiding a language that criminalizes migration and that doesn't understand this as a global phenomenon is the first thing. The second is creating legal pathways. As long as there are no legal pathways for migrants and refugees and a recognition of their need for international protection in the receiving countries, then that creates incentives for people to flee the origin country or the transit countries, including Colombia, through unauthorized crossings. And that in turn also creates incentives for illicit economies, for armed groups, for human traffickers that profit from this. Adam Isaacson, our colleague at WOLA, and we were in Necoclí last year. When we went there, Human Rights Watch had just released their report. And I remember having this discussion with our partners when they said from Human Rights Watch that they had documented that crossing through the Darien Gap, at least in the route from Necoclí to Apartado, was around $125. And by the time that we arrived there, it was already almost $300 for that same route. So imagine how much money are these smugglers making out of the lack of pathways and the vulnerability of people. And I would also
$300 a head? Sorry.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was $130 more than what our colleagues had documented just 6 months before. So the amount of money keeps increasing because of the demand. And the other thing that I would like to say, or this story that I feel like for me is very telling, and I believe that the Vice President mentioned this, the temporary status of protection in Colombia is also a limited measure. It was not perfect, but of course it was the best that Colombia has had so far in integration of migrants. And what it established was a date in which people could access, if they had entered prior to January 31st of 2021, they could still access the measure even if they enter the country irregularly. That means that everyone that entered the country after January 31st of 2021, that's 3 years ago, they don't no longer have access to that measure. Now, the temporary status of protection, that measure brought an exception for children. For children that were enrolled in a school program, they can still have access to the document as long as the measure is current until 2031. So what happened when we were at Nicoclí in the Darien Gap? We conducted these interviews and we were talking to some families, and we saw a family that had children with the document, but the parents did not. So we were asking, like, why are you leaving if your children can access education? And they said, well, what good is it if my children can access school and we cannot work to provide food for them? So why am I telling this story? Because it's absolutely necessary that states connect to the reality of the people and start understanding the need for integral, holistic, and human rights approaches to migration. There is no use for fragmented policies when it comes to opening legal pathways. One recommendation that has been done by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in their report concerning human mobility from Venezuela is also, as I mentioned before, the application of the Cartagena Declaration. Recognition prima facie or a priori recognition of certain groups as in need of international protection is absolutely crucial. The other aspect is not defunding integration efforts. You mentioned, Jeff, how to balance working for the root cause, which is the political and economical crisis in Venezuela, and at the same time working to receive migrants and refugees. And I would like to have some polite pushback on something that David said. Concerning the fact that if there were to be a transition in Venezuela, people would immediately go back. And I do think that it's necessary to understand how deep the complex humanitarian emergency is, the impact that it has, and the possibility of a fast recovery. I would like to put that into question whether it would be immediate, because I think that while there is an absolute necessity to continue working for democracy in Venezuela, and that should be, of course, a priority. At the same time, there needs to be an understanding that migration won't stop in the short run and in the short term. And the reason why I'm saying this is because based on the evidence published by Venezuela, which is a platform that documents the complex humanitarian emergency in Venezuela, prior to the elections, there had been an increase of 13% of intention of migrating in this year. And I must say that in this context of political repression, Venezuela had to take out their website for public consumption, but they continue to do the work of documentation, and it's yet to be seen how there has been an increase in that 13% intention of migration after the July 28th elections, and how could it continue to increase after January 10th. So again, countries need to understand that this is a reality, and that as long as there are no ways of integration, they're actually feeding into the economies of those smugglers and armed groups.
Thanks. No, it's an important point. And I'm glad you mentioned the issue of data collection, because I think, many of us looking at this issue regionally are sort of really hungry for good data on this question. Of course, the UNHCR and IOM have created this platform, the R4V platform, which has been a decent source of information on more or less estimates of totals of Venezuelan migrants and refugees across the hemisphere. But even that basically suffers from inconsistencies in reporting across countries, different timeframes for reporting to the platform. I'm wondering, Paula, how do you see this issue of data collection? Is there more that can be done to ensure that we actually have an accurate snapshot of the total numbers of fleeing Venezuelans across the hemisphere? And how can we improve data collection systems in country to ensure that governments are actually measuring the impact of their response to this?
Thank you, Jeff. Yes, the limitation many times with this kind of situations to have accurate sort of pictures of the situation at a given time is compounded. These situations evolve all the time. And it's very difficult, and they evolve not necessarily at the same speed in different places. So for example, while in Colombia, the transit of people started to decrease, the cross-border crossing in countries like Chile was at its peak. So it doesn't necessarily mean that all countries have a sort of synchronized systems to provide a snapshot at any given point. Also, for many Latin American countries, the influx of population was completely unanticipated. And most of countries in Latin America, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, certainly were not countries that had frameworks that enable neither the integration of this population nor the measurement or capture through statistical instruments of this population. So all the adaptations in institutions, data frameworks and instruments that I have mentioned before regarding regularization have also taken place in data collection, analysis, and use systems. The three critical parts that can be done or can be the critical steps that can be taken to improve data in host countries entails improvements in three main areas. The first one is data collection systems. The most cost-effective way of collecting data and understanding, sort of being able to extrapolate how many people there is in the country, what are their conditions, and what are their characteristics is through national surveys. However, many national surveys do not have the way to build the sampling framework or a sampling framework that is adequate to capture a true picture of the situation. We have been working with the national statistics departments in Colombia and Peru and Ecuador to develop these systems so they are able to identify where, how many of these people are in the country, where they are, what are their characteristics, and what would be the right policies that can be taken in order to improve their integration. In some countries, doing this is very expensive or it will take a long time. So we have also done standalone surveys to Venezuelans, like we have done in Peru, 2 rounds, in Colombia, several other rounds, to understand the more specific situation of this population. But the best and the most cost-effective way is through national surveys. The second component for improving data analysis and data intake is actually not just collecting this data, but being able to analyze it. And analysis is not, it goes beyond descriptive analysis, is understanding what are the implications of this data that systems are capturing for policies and for systems, for markets and services, so we can actually provide policy recommendations on how to adapt these different systems and markets in order to reduce cost and increase the return of integration. And the third aspect, which I will highlight, is to make sure that this data is used by policymakers. One critical example that I can think of is the Observatory of Venezuelan Migrants that the National Planning Department has developed here in Colombia. This observatory measures integration in several different aspects through a component index and compares that integration level with local communities in several municipalities across the country. And that has served as a basis for several of the newly elected mayors to identify where are the specific gaps in service provision or in the integration for Venezuelans and where to invest their resources to enhance their inclusion. So these kind of tools actually enhance the intake and the utilization of data for policymaking, because otherwise, data on its own does not do the job.
Thanks. Question for you, David. We have a question here about the Cartagena Declaration. It's I recall that several years ago that this issue really was front and center. We saw sort of an embrace of the Cartagena Declaration across the region, and of course, its broader definition of who constitutes a refugee as someone who's fleeing their life, I think, due to a threat to their life, security, or freedom. Right. So, I mean, how do you see this, the relevance of the Cartagena Declaration today, and how do you see this issue that Laura raised, right? That if Maduro gets on a plane to Moscow tomorrow, the economy is a fraction of what it once was. How do you see sort of the need to balance the response to the situation politically and the need for democracy, as well as attending to the needs of fleeing Venezuelans in the meantime?
Yeah, well, so regarding the first question, I have to say that it was always frustrating for me when it was at the OES that there was no regional uh, consensus on implementing the Cartagena Declaration, which is the only agreement that expands the concept of a refugee from the United Nations. Having said that, it is interesting that Brazil is implementing the Cartagena Declaration collectively since 2019, and Mexico has been implementing it as well individually since 2019 or 2020. It was not possible to recognize Venezuelans as refugees, like, for example, Syrians are, Afghans are, Ukrainians are, and, well, from this humble public servant, for me, Venezuelans are refugees. People have been forced to flee the country, the vast majority. However, I have to recognize the efforts that some governments have made during this decade to create their own protocol to protect and attend Venezuelan migrants and refugees. And I have to recognize what former President Duque and former Vice President Marta Lucía Ramirez did. Laura mentioned it on the TPS, the Estatuto Temporal de Protección that Colombia is implementing, because I said to former President Duque in that moment that it is not temporary at all, because it lasts 10 years. And you have your documentation that guarantees access to education, healthcare, to work. And after some years, you can apply to be a permanent resident of Colombia and then to become a Colombian citizenship. Also, we saw in Costa Rica another example, for example, that they provided a complementary status for those who were rejected of asylum seeker or refugee status. So Peru had also a temporary protected status. The US finally implemented it as well. So even though we didn't have a regional consensus, at least we have many countries implementing their own protocols. And regarding what Laura said, which is always very, very interesting to discuss with Laura. Obviously, Venezuela is in shatters, and Venezuela, we have to rebuild the country from the scratch on everything: healthcare, education, energy, security, environment, infrastructure, you name it. And probably it will be unstable during the first month or the first few years of a democratic government. In my opinion, this is a very personal opinion, the main challenge that Venezuela will have is criminality. It's all the drug cartels, the non-state armed groups, and the external actors such as Wagner, Iran, that are in Venezuela. Those will be the main challenge that we're going to have on a democratic transition. I'm not that afraid on the energy sector, infrastructure, or basic services. I think there are plenty of people and plenty of civil society organizations and plenty of international organizations that, if we do that very well coordinated, efficiently, and transparently, we're going to address all those different challenges. So we'll see. Probably some people might flee on that situation, but I'm optimistic. I think we will stop people fleeing Venezuela if we achieve a democratic transition and people start seeing things that change, and also will encourage people to go back. One of the things that I want to contribute more is the rights of migrants and refugees in a democratic government. We need our migrants to vote. We couldn't vote on this election. 4.5 million Venezuelans that were banned of voting. That's an atrocity. Even Turkish in Germany were able to vote last year. I mean, you see other governments. The elections here in elections this year of Latin America, that we saw Dominicans voting in New York. We see Mexicans voting in Arizona, but we were banned for voting. We need Venezuelans to have the right to political and civil rights, and no matter where they are. We need human rights, the right of identity. we cannot beg anymore for a passport. We need Venezuelans to have a passport, a new passport, or renew a passport. And we have been a victim of discrimination. So those are the type of policies that I'm very enthusiastic to implement as soon as a democratic government starts in Venezuela. And just to end, there are beautiful examples on contemporary history on how a diaspora contributed for a rebuilding of a country, or important diaspora went back to a country. We have the case from Israel, that the diaspora has contributed a lot to the development of Israel, but we have also important migration communities that have gone back to their country, such as Chile in Latin America, such as Croatia, such as South Korea. So we need to do the same as soon as the democratic transition starts in Venezuela. And to think that Venezuela will be rebuilt without its migrants and refugees is naive. We will need our migrants and refugees to be part of the rebuilding of our country. Hopefully, most of them inside the country, and others that will not go back, because that's logical. Not many people will go back because they have their families, jobs, school. They will contribute from wherever they are, and it's easier than in the past in an interconnected world. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I'm glad you're optimistic. Listen, anytime we can have a conversation on Venezuela at the Atlantic Council with an element of optimism, I call it a good day. So I appreciate you injecting the optimism here. We're coming up close on time, but I did have one more question for the panel. Paula, Laura, David. We've seen in recent years host countries like Colombia and Brazil, adapt to the flow of migrants and refugees by broadening access to regular status. But of course, that doesn't guarantee formal employment necessarily, and it doesn't guarantee perfect protection from abuse. Are there opportunities for host countries to tap into public-private partnerships, working with NGOs, development organizations? Are there ways that we can ensure that fleeing Venezuelans, who are often in vulnerable positions, are not put into these potentially abusive situations? And how do you think we can sort of guide the conversation in that direction in the months and years to come? I don't know if Laura, you want to start us off.
Yes, great. And I'm sure that Paula will have a lot to say about this, because the IDB has done so much work on integration and a lot of research with people like Ana Maria Ibanez, who's an expert on this issue. So the first step, again, sounding repetitive, has to do with legal pathways, and then of course the private sector working with governments. But I think what I would say from my years working in Colombia for migrants and refugees, I spent 5 years working at Los Andes University on this issue, is that of course, there needs to be a coordination between governments and the private sector, but there also needs to be an acknowledgement of the need to work with host communities. So when you talk about integration, this means not only working for the integration of migrants and refugees, just looking at them in a siloed way, but rather working with the communities and making sure that the host communities can understand that the integration of migrants is in their own benefit, rather than a competition, which is often the case, right? That there are competing wages. Sometimes migrants and refugees are doing the work that people in the host community do for a lower reward or for a lower amount of money. And that creates also tension. So I would say that it's necessary to work with the receiving communities or the host communities, and also to work on this as the need for a cultural shift. Because I remember in the case of Colombia, when the temporary status of protection was created, there were a lot of administrative measures or notifications to the private sector, to the banks, etc., to include the TPS as a document for migrants and refugees. And sometimes, even with those measures in place, the private sector would not recognize the documents for a lot of what has to do with the xenophobia. So it's very important to stress that. And the other thing that I would mention specifically for the case of Colombia is that there was a law approved in 2021 that brings a whole chapter on integration that was never regulated. So there's also a need to continue advancing and building upon the things that have already been done in the past.
Thanks. Paula, how do you see it?
Yes, no, I mean, absolutely. There is lots to do on this aspect. And I think that from our end, we see it. We think that part of the issue is that migration is seen frequently as a problem instead of an opportunity. And these include, for example, what it entails for the private sector. They are not just employment providers. The private sector is also a producer of goods and services that are demanded by these people who are now also consuming in host countries. There are also actors that influence the dialogue for the adoption of policies, and there are also actors that are that influence the social perception and the social cohesion between host and migrants. So at the World Bank, we have recently approved our regional strategy for migration and forced displacement, and precisely this public-private solutions aspect is a central one of the 5 pillars of that strategy. To that aspect, we're trying to focus on solving market failures that are impeding integration, working together with our sister organization, the International Finance Corporation, in such a way that we can both coordinately work the World Bank on the public side through, for example, policies like regularization or enabling access to markets, and on their side of developing services and products tailored to the needs of these populations. One example I'm going to give you, in the financial system, the regularization in Colombia enable free access to all markets, including the financial market. Following that, the Superintendency of Financial Services issued a regulation that says that Venezuelans were eligible to the same services than Colombians. But financial services were not tailored to their needs. The IFC complemented the efforts that we have been doing, developing specific products for this population and unlocking a market that was sort of completely captive for banks that are entering the financial market in Colombia. So thinking of that kind of solutions and working hand in hand with the private sector will enable not just creating this potential for inclusion, because it's the right thing to do, because it's a moral commitment, but also because there are strong economic incentives and rationale behind that inclusion, and because it will become a motor for growth and opportunities for everyone in the country.
Thanks. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I do want to thank you all for joining us for this panel. We've heard about the importance of expanding access to regular status for Venezuelans. I think it's pretty clear that regularization isn't just a humane response, it's a smart one. It creates stability for families and strengthens local economies and allows host communities to thrive alongside the very people that they're welcoming. We've also discussed the need for greater burden sharing. Obviously, no one country should bear this responsibility alone. And we at the Council are going to be focusing on ways to encourage greater thinking on fostering partnerships between governments, private sector, and civil society in ways that encourage the integration of Venezuelan migrants and refugees. Of course, as we continue to encourage the U.S. and our partners to work for a democratic solution inside Venezuela. So I want to encourage everybody listening to follow the work of our amazing panelists, David Smolansky, Laura Dib, Paula Rosiasco. Thank you all again for taking time with us on a Tuesday afternoon. And stay tuned. This is not the last that you will have heard from us at the Council on this issue. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Quiero que aunque norte y sur sean distintos, lleven un mismo latido en el ritmo, como quien comparte el mismo apellido, porque al fin y al al cabo somos latinos. Quiero que la unión que logra la fuerza rompa divisiones y abra más puertas. Quiero que entendamos que cuando todos sumamos se hace la diferencia. Diversos como hay palabras en el